Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone had a good afternoon thus far. So my name is Mark Bishop. I am the PRO for the AAPG Young Professionals Trinidad and Tobago chapter. And today we have a very timely slash relevant talk, which is titled, People Powering the Clean Energy Transition. And we are very fortunate to have this being delivered to us by Azell Francis. So before I actually hand things over to Azell, if you just give me a couple minutes just to let you know a bit about Azell. So Azell Francis is an energy policy analyst and a doctoral student at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is a small island scholar and centers her research on energy and sustainable development. Azell has a BSc in mechanical engineering and a master's in applied engineering, engineering management, I guess. Also, just a gentle reminder that if you do have any questions, feel free to send them in the Q&A tab, which is located to the bottom of your screen, or sorry, the chat window, sorry, which is located to the bottom of your screen. And yeah, I guess with that being said, I would now invite Azell to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this presentation today. And I just want to add that this presentation is designed to be interactive, and I want to make sure that you're taking away something from this. So if you do, again, if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to use that Q&A box, and I will be looking at it and can stop and answer the questions that you have. So let's get started. I believe in always telling people the bottom line up front. So what are you going to take away from today's talk? We're going to talk a little bit about the energy transition, the sustainable energy transition. There are a couple names for it. We're going to center it on the local landscape in Trinidad and Tobago, not talking too much about the local context, because as young professionals in Trinidad and Tobago, you are the experts on the local context. So I'm just going to offer some broad overview. And then we'll end really with a conversation about how can you position yourself for success within this energy transition? Because the idea, as petroleum geoscientists, you are experts at what you do. And even though we are going through a transitionary process, that does not mean that you're going to be left behind or that you need to immediately start thinking about what other degree can I get. So just to give you a little bit about my presentation philosophy, I believe presentations should be always engaging and meaningful. My background, I worked as a design engineer and then pivoted or transitioned out of that into engineering management. And now I pivoted again and really focus on this idea of energy policy analysis and sustainable development work. So I think key terminologies are also important to define in a talk, because that allows us to set the expectation and for all of us to also be utilizing a common language so that we know exactly what we're talking about. So what do we mean by an energy transition? It put simply, it's a shift in the energy mix from one source or multiple sources to other sources. When you're thinking about it in the global context, you're thinking about an energy mix that is predominantly dominated by fossil fuels or conventional sources being transitioned into a zero carbon energy mix with a variety of sources that are considered to be renewable or clean. IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, defines an energy transition as a pathway toward transformation of the global energy sector from fossil-based to zero carbon by the second half of this century. So at its heart, really, a transition or an energy transition for us means that there's this need to reduce energy-related carbon dioxide emissions to limit climate change. So how do we do this, right? Decarbonization of the energy sector would really require an urgent shift or urgent action, not just on a local or country level, but globally. So while this global energy transition is underway, you really need a lot of action to reduce carbon emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. Two of the ways or pathways that play major roles in this energy transition are renewable energy and then energy efficiency. So those two measures can actually potentially achieve 90% of the required carbon reductions necessary for that energy transition. So again, the energy transition is enabled by lots of things. Some of the examples that I'll give you are it'll be enabled by IT, so information technology. It'll be enabled by smart technology, utilizing the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. It'll be enabled by strong policy frameworks, so being sure that you are grounded in policy that is designed to achieve an effective and efficient energy transition. And then lastly, it'll also be grounded or enabled by market instruments or tools. However, so this all sounds really grand and big and different, right? And typically, when you think of things that are different, there's also this fear that accompanies it. But if you think about historically, this isn't our first energy transition. So if we situate the energy transition in a historical context, we can actually divide it into four eras. So there's the prehistoric era, where the earliest forms of fuel used for transport, for example, were humans and wind energy. While you saw biomass being used for light and heat. So during this era, the focus really was on this idea of subsistence agriculture. So the human labor was able to meet the population's needs for food. Um, there was not a need for excess labor, and you could easily prioritize your environment. So in this era, you could consider that we had achieved already sustainable energy security, and we had a really sustainable energy mix. So this is one area, right? We then transitioned into the colonial era. And during this era, the focus really shifted from subsistence agriculture to export agriculture. And with this shift, we needed the production of a variety of and larger quantities of agricultural produce. So therefore, the entire production system had to transform, and additional labor was needed to achieve export agriculture. And you saw that in this colonial era was where we had that energy transition to fossil fuels. And fossil fuels really became the dominant energy source. Um, Dr. Benjamin Sovacool, he also utilizes this historical context and frames the energy transitions in the context of other transitions. So he says that transitions can be excruciatingly slow, but that if you get conditions right, they can go faster. So he looks at the Industrial Revolution, where you saw this heavy fossil fuel dependence globally, which then there was the oil crisis of 1973. And with the oil crisis, you then had really high oil prices, which actually caused a renewed interest in renewable energy and a revitalization, of this idea of RE transition, or clean energy transition. And then brings us to the present, where you're seeing in the Caribbean in particular, the need for development finance in order to transition into this clean energy framework. And geoscience can actually help to make the fossil to renewables transition even faster. So the oil and gas industry, directly and indirectly, accounts for 42% of global emissions. That's huge. And as such, the industry executives are really facing some key trends or thoughts. they're having a large push from their investors, pushing the companies to disclose consistent, comparable, and reliable data. You're seeing that investors have become increasingly environmentally conscious, and you've seen a dramatic increase in sustainable investment. In fact, sustainable investing accounted for a third of all investments in 2018. You've also seen the other push is that you're seeing renewable energy technologies becoming cheaper and cheaper. In most places now, power from new renewables is actually cheaper than power generated from new fossil fuels. So why or how are renewables able to leapfrog or change so dramatically? One of the big drivers is that renewable energy technologies follow these learning curves, so that each time each doubling, of their cumulative installed capacity, their price declines by that same fraction. So essentially, the price of electricity from fossil fuels, that doesn't follow the same learning curve. So in the future, we could expect that the price difference between fossil fuels and renewables can become even larger. For the oil and gas to actually play the key role that it has to play in order to reduce its emissions by 3.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050, compared with our business as usual, which is currently planned policies or technologies. It requires a 90% reduction in current emissions. So reaching this target would be easy, right? If we just stopped using oil and gas completely. But even given that demand won't fall that much, the sector can actually abate much of its emissions by prioritizing the most cost-effective interventions. Companies have been doing this and started to choose specific initiatives to reduce its emissions, but it depends on certain factors. One of the key factors is the country's geography, the asset mix that the country has, so offshore versus onshore, gas versus oil, upstream versus downstream. What are the country's local policies and practices? That is, are there any regulations? Do they participate in carbon pricing? What is the availability of renewables in that country? And then also the grid, is it a centralized grid, a decentralized grid? And how reliable is that infrastructure? So there's a lot of key factors that countries and the companies that are operating in those countries need to consider as they think about which initiatives they should implement to reduce their emissions. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I put it up here so that you can see that current technologies can actually address most of the ONG industry's emissions today. So one of the ones that I wanted to highlight, because I am talking to a group of geoscientists, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The idea is that if you were able to increase carbon capture, use, and storage, it won't play a major role in the oil and gas industry's overall decarbonization, but it can the players or the key players in the industry can significantly influence CCUS adoption and development. So let's bring it down from the global perspective quickly to talk about Trinidad and Tobago. And I highlighted here BP Trinidad and Tobago as that is our largest player. So we've seen major oil and gas companies, along with the International Energy Agency, really have this expectation that there is and will be a continuing role for oil and gas for several decades, right? But the role has to be used strategically and within strict carbon budgets. And you'll notice that I highlighted the carbon. So you'll see this example from BP, where the oil major announced that a shift from being an international oil company to being an international energy company. So with that transformation and BP's transition, you also saw that they in June announced that they were going to lay off almost 15% of its workforce, right? And many of those layoffs came from office-based staff, including BP's core oil and gas exploration and production division, which is where thousands of engineers, geoscientists, geologists, and scientists operate. So we have seen the impact of this transition from being an IOC to an IEC in Trinidad and Tobago. And as petroleum geoscientists, I'm sure that that is something that you've been concerned about. But fear not, because you play a major role in the solution and in that clean energy transition. So SDG 7, which is to be achieved by 2030, seeks to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy, right? The idea behind this is that many of the targets are actually closely associated with geoscience. For example, the need for exploration and feasibility studies for subsurface renewables, such as geothermal. And I'll highlight here that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, it has a 10 megawatts, geothermal plant that they're trying to bring on stream. Then you also need geoscience for the development of the technology for sustainable use of fossil fuels, again, within this idea of the strict carbon budgets. So geoscience plays an integral role even as you transition away from being a fossil fuel dominant energy mix to being a sustainable or renewable energy mix with fossil fuels included. Speaking of renewables, even at the COP21, there was an acknowledgement, a tacit acknowledgement at that, of the role that geoscience and the subsurface will play in decarbonizing electricity production, industry, transport, as well as heating. Some of the key technologies that were discussed included the decarbonization of electricity production via renewables, as we've discussed, substitution of domestic heating using geothermal energy, this idea of the use of carbon capture and storage, more ambitious technologies as well, like bioenergy that seeks and carbon capture and storage that really target this idea of negative emissions. But it has to also be noted that with an increased growth in renewable energy technologies, there's also this increased demand for geological materials that sustain it. So we'll need those materials to sustain the electrification of EVs or any electric vehicles, as well as any other low carbon technologies. So to put it simply, geoscience and geoscientists are critical to this decarbonization process and in fact are powering this clean energy transition. But you as a geoscience community have to be firstly aware of the importance of your role and then influence the policymakers and decision makers so that the value of the subsurface to decarbonization is truly understood. Because again, you are the experts. So again, geoscientists and their skill sets are a critical part of this clean energy or sustainable energy transition. Some of the areas that you have the skills that are needed for, and I'm just going to highlight 3, but there are many more, include subsurface storage, geothermal energy, sustainable metals, as well as mineral resources. You have a lot of these skills that typically that can be easily transferred from the petroleum industry into the renewable space. Not saying that petroleum industry is going away, but saying that as it shifts its focus to have a large incorporation of renewables, that you too can shift your focus from being solely petroleum geoscientist to embracing just the geoscientist piece and utilizing the same skill set in a broader energy context. So, when by using the word clean energy, there's this perception that there's also dirty energy. And when you think of dirty energy, there's an association with petroleum, oil and gas, coal, but coal is even, dirtier. So there's like dirtier fuels and clean fuels, right? So then you're seeing this kind of growing perception as well that geoscience and petroleum geoscience as dirty. So therefore, you're seeing also less or fewer courses being offered, but those skills from geoscience are still relevant today and are still valuable today and can still be transferred into the broader energy transition context. However, in order for you to be successful, you may also need some supplemental training to broaden your skill set. So your core competencies are still critical, but there's some additional or supplemental training that may be of value. So in today's energy environment, some things that you may want to focus on would be a stronger knowledge of economics, developing your communication skills, a greater focus on social sciences such as public policy and regulation, understanding artificial intelligence and where that is going in the future, being competent at data analysis as well as data visualization will also be assets that you can add to your portfolio. Notice I'm using these words of adding and supplemental to highlight that you have core competencies that do power this transition. So the key takeaway from my talk today really is that as we think about the people that are powering the energy transition or the sustainable energy transition, you as geoscientists are not to be discounted. Geoscience and petroleum geoscientists are a key component of the solution, not the problem. However, in order for us to move forward with this transition, we do need to have more honest conversations about the role of petroleum geoscientists and geoscientists more broadly. What is their role, or your role rather, in a sustainable future, a sustainable energy future? And also really identify and hone in to how important the skills that you have are and bringing them into the fold as we continue and accelerate this clean energy or sustainable energy transition. And that is my presentation for today, but I will pause for any questions.
Thank you so much, Azell, for that truly informative and truly informative talk. I really hope that it was beneficial to everyone in attendance, in particular the recent grads. I know you mentioned about the supplemental training, and I kind of really appreciated the transition timeline that you showed at the beginning of your presentation. That was kind of kind of interesting to know. So I guess at this point in time, I think we'll just open the floor to any questions that any of the attendees may have. You guys are free to ask your questions at this point in time. But I guess I could kick off the kick off the questions. Just it's a general question. I think, like in your opinion, what is like the biggest like hurdle that you think may be causing a slow transition towards this clean energy?
The biggest hurdle for the
Um,
globally or the biggest hurdle within a Caribbean
with
context?
with any Caribbean, yeah.
Within the Caribbean, there So, okay, let me make sure I explain this well. Within the Caribbean, one of the biggest hurdles, so there are a couple barriers to the development of sustainable energy within the region. But one key barrier that you would often hear from government officials is this idea of a lack of financing. So there's a huge need for development finance from international agencies, um, private organizations to because renewables, yes, they have gone down and are cheaper, but oftentimes within the region, we do not have the capacity as governments to invest necessarily in that type of infrastructure. So it tends to be easier to seek donor financing or energy aid, which can be made up of loans or grants to develop renewable energy infrastructure within your country. So financing is one big barrier. The other barrier, however, is that a lot of times there's a mismatch of priorities. So if I am giving you money as a donor, my priority tends to get moved to the top. So governments need to be really sure that they are attracting the donors whose priorities align with theirs, because you can get energy aid that invests in critical energy infrastructure, but that does not stipulate necessarily that it needs to be from sustainable energy, right? So it could be coming from your fossil fuels, your typical conventional sources. But if you have a donor who prioritizes sustainability and sustainable energy security, then they would be more inclined to invest in energy infrastructure projects that are sustainable in nature versus fossil fuels. So I think those are the two barriers that I'll highlight as being critical to overcoming the slower pace of renewable energy development in the Caribbean.
Thanks for that. I saw we have one question in the Q&A, and someone is asking you to please explain scope 3 emissions.
Yes. I'm gonna pull that back up. Um, okay, so make sure. Yeah. So basically, scope 3 emissions focuses on on your value chain. So not just I'm trying to make sure I explain this clearly. So um, it's not just like your operations, but it would also incorporate like down downstream activities. So not just like your extraction and production, but any activity, essentially. For example, in order for an oil and gas company, any activity that is indirectly related to oil and gas, and but still part of the value chain. So it can incorporate emissions from transport costs to manufacturing of the materials that are utilized in the oil and gas industry as well. Does that make sense? So it's a very broad look at the ONG value chain and not just how a company is operated. So a lot of times it will be where, it won't account for necessarily only the emissions within a country, but it'll also account for it more broadly, so global value chain. I hope that was a long, convoluted answer, but essentially it's a broad value chain inclusion. And that's from the McKinsey oil and gas uh, oil and gas insight. And I'm happy to send that to you for further clarification.
All right, thanks. So we have another question that says, you mentioned sustainable mineral extraction for the renewable industry. Can you please elaborate on which minerals can be extracted sustainably, since sustainable extraction seems like a contradictory phrase,
Yeah,
sorry.
no problem. So one of the big things is this idea that sustainability means that you're able to do it where you meet your present needs without compromising your future needs. So it's not that you are so it's not that you are extracting any different minerals that are needed, but rather that you're extracting enough. So if we rather than excess, so you're making sure that you are being, I don't want to use the word sustainable, but you're making sure that you're being efficient, maybe a better phrase, and extracting just enough. So kind of similar if you think back to the idea of subsistence agriculture, where you're just meeting the needs and you're not making any excess for export. If we were to bring it into today's era where we're talking about sustainable extraction, it's making sure that we're not always trying to get the to get excess, and also making sure that we're doing a closed loop cycle as well, where you are reusing and recycling any minerals, so that you can have that you can meet the demand for today and meet the future demand.
All right. Um, we have one more question here, and Daniel is asking, what steps do you think the government needs to take in this present climate to start the transition into renewable energy?
It's a great question. So the government of Trinidad and Tobago has had a sustainable energy framework policy for a while, and you can debate whether or not it's been implemented to date. But one of the things that I think the government has done and can continue to do is to be really involved in the Caribbean region and take the lead, even though we are an oil and gas, predominantly gas producing country. We can still take the lead in the region and show that our renewable energy targets, and our renewable energy ambitions are real. So in order for that to be considered to be real, the government doesn't only need to talk the talk, we also need to walk the walk, right? So we need to be sure that we are not just creating policies that then become desktop policies or policies that you only see online. We need to be sure that we're actually also implementing these policies. We need to be having broader conversations as a country about how are we being sustainable with our energy use. In Trinidad and Tobago, a big problem that we have is not even it's not even so much the renewable piece, which is important, yes, but I think more broadly we need to focus on energy efficiency, because that would allow us to actually better utilize our gas resources than we are today. The average citizen in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly with electricity use, is not very aware of how high our consumption patterns are because of the low cost of our electricity. But our electricity is subsidized, and therefore that subsidy that I would I would put forward that the subsidy should be removed, but that would probably get me a lot of people not disagreeing. But the subsidy would allow you to then, knowing what the subsidy is, and putting in place proper social protections, of course, so that the most vulnerable in society aren't negatively impacted if you do remove said subsidy, but allowing people to really just understand the role that individual consumers can play in that sustainable energy transition, I think is important. So having a public awareness campaigns, having a lot of talks where people are able to really engage with energy, not just from a technical perspective, but where they are able to understand it on a more casual or common level is important.
Right. So I think we have two more questions. I know Alex had one, and I have one more question for you. So
Okay.
I will let Alex go ahead.
Hi, Azell. Really great presentation.
Thank
I
you.
just have one question. It's more of an energy policy question.
Okay.
So I know in recent years, restrictive supply side policies have become a large talking point, particularly because they're projected to be incredibly effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So my question is, seeing that demand is inelastic, the demand for fossil fuels in particular is inelastic, how feasible are these supply side policies?
That's a really big question. So
Yeah, I know it's a complex question. Yeah.
and honestly, I think that it has to be the right combination of policies. Because here's what the issue is, right? I agree, demand is inelastic. But oftentimes people think that there's like one policy mechanism that is like this like magic fix. So you'll see feed-in tariffs, for example, because that was hailed as the revolutionary mechanism for increasing solar and wind in Germany and Spain and a couple other European countries. So then the World Bank took the feed-in tariff um, as a as a key tool for everyone that wanted to increase renewables. They should have feed-in tariffs, right? So then they created this framework for developing countries, of which the Caribbean is a focus, to have a feed-in tariff mechanism in place. But in the Caribbean, for example, the feed-in tariff has actually been very slow to get uptake, particularly because it's expensive. So in terms of feasibility, we need to think about costs. And a lot of times that's not part of the larger conversation is the cost of the policy. So the feed-in tariff tends to be very expensive. So feasibility for us as the Caribbean, where you don't necessarily have that extra money, you're asking whether or not this policy, the outcome will be worth the cost that is associated with it. So from an economic perspective, the feed-in tariff has not been the direction that we've chosen to go in. Rather, in the Caribbean, you've seen a combination of other supply side policies, and you've seen some success in countries like Jamaica. Barbados has seen success, particularly with its tax incentives and tax breaks for solar water heating. You've also seen success in the Dominican Republic by a utilization of um, net metering as well as net billing. Um, so a big piece of the feasibility piece of supply side policies tends to be how am I going to pay for it? But development financing tends to be the direction with which our islands take. And there have been cases of successful implementation of supply side policies, but in combination, not as one policy that was able to save all, you know?
Yeah, thank you so much. That actually gives me one other question. So, like you said, effective policy really is having a combination of the right policy instruments. And what I'm wondering, seeing that information on energy policy locally is so limited, do you think that locally they're doing the type of, well, the depth of policy analysis needed to come up with that effective combination of instruments for us to reach to that point?
Um, I don't know. I don't know. That's the first piece. Is I'll go ahead and say I don't know. I will say that I think so. Effective policy also is premised upon data, and data locally is very hard to come by. Accurate data is very hard to come by for people to be able to conduct these analyses. So I would say that um, there should be stronger collaboration between policymakers and institutions such as the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, so that they are able to um, implement some data collection processes that work, and then be able to analyze said data and make policy decisions based on sound and accurate data, not just policy decisions that work in other countries that are similar, but the context is never exactly the same.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome. That was a hard question.
All right, so my last question is COVID-19, right? How did this affect this whole energy transition, both globally and in a Caribbean context, in your opinion?
I love the in my opinion. I like to give my opinion. So one of the good things that there has been a lot of research actually done on the COVID-19 impacts on global energy use. And you've actually seen, because of the fact that the world essentially came to a standstill, there was a decrease in transportation. There's a decrease in the utilization of energy for transportation, is what I was trying to say. So you saw that go down, and that allowed us to also have lower carbon dioxide emissions during this period. However, you've also seen in the more developed countries, you've seen an increase in electricity usage, because you're now seeing people being at home and working from home more. So you're having that piece, but it has also it's kind of interesting, because companies have also been able to lower their electricity usage. So in some ways it has balanced out from an electricity perspective, but definitely from a transportation side of things, and transportation accounts for a huge chunk. I want to say transportation accounts for like 16% of emissions, while if you think about it, power accounts for about 27% of emissions. So, you know, transport is huge. It's one of the top three, I think, industries or sources of carbon dioxide emissions. So being able to reduce your carbon dioxide emissions from people being at home and not being able to travel as much was definitely significant. I think it's important to add that caveat, though, that COVID-19, though it did see that one positive, there's been so many there's so much loss of life and so many other negatives, that I don't want to ever be misconstrued as thinking that it was a positive thing. But from a carbon dioxide emission, specifically within transport, yes, you did see that reduction.
All right, thanks so much, Azal. Um, really appreciate this talk today. So if there's no more questions, I would just like to remind everyone to join us on the 18th of December for our first virtual Sip and Paint event. I think we have spots are still available. I know the deadline was today, so please go and register. You could find the registration link on all our social media pages. So just a reminder, Friday the 18th of December, our first virtual Sip and Paint event. Again, thank you so much, Azell, for this talk. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for attending, and do enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much for your time and for the attention and for the great questions. I appreciate the opportunity today.
No problem at all.
Right. Take care.
And bye-bye.